Hello, and welcome to the Culture Connection Speaker Series. I'm Michael Beckelheimer. I'm in Alexandria, Virginia. This program is presented by the American Center of Moscow, which is supported by the American Embassy in Moscow. And if you're watching on the American Center's YouTube, VK, or Telegram channels, please post comments and questions at any time, and we'll ask them as we go along. So today I'm talking to Shawn Halifax, who is a public historian. He collaborates with people and communities to preserve and share their history. His career is characterized by opening new sites or revisiting old historic sites, including the development of public history programs in McLeod Plantation Historic Site, the first historic plantation in South Carolina, with the sole purpose to interpret the lives of enslaved people and their descendants. He has worked with the Charleston County and Park and Recreation Commission, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation, Middleton Place Foundation, the Fort Monroe Authority, all very well known and important historical organizations here in the United States, as well as many other historical sites and museums across the country. He lives in Fairfax, Virginia. Shawn, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks a lot, Michael. It's great to be here.
So let's start by understanding what a public historian does.
Oh, that's a really good question. So a public historian is really, it's a little different than an academic historian, who is the person that's back there doing the original research. Although public historians do research, what public historians are really focused on is making that history at these historic sites and at museums something that's accessible for the general public. So a lot of the work that we do is referred to as interpretation. And basically what that is taking that research that's been done, whether it's archival research or archaeological research, whatever has been done, and then formatting that into a package that people then can, that lay people that may not have a background in history can then take advantage of. So and we refer to that as an interpretation.
So it's essentially taking the very complicated, complex history and making it understandable for the general audiences, right?
Exactly.
So does the interpretation part of that, does that refer to the making the history understood, or does that refer to making it fit into a political sort of dynamic, or making the history appropriate for the times?
Yeah, so what interpretation is it moves beyond just the facts of history, and it starts to look into and presenting different perspectives of the people that experience that history, and also, of course, looking at it through the lens of the person who's doing the interpreting. So as someone that looks like me brings a particular understanding and association with history, and so that influences how I share these stories. And oftentimes, interpretation is meant to be thematic in the sense that it does have a theme that it is following. And that's so you can take all of these different bits and pieces of history and fit them together in something that's cohesive and understandable and relatable, so that people can relate it to their own lives. And it's something that they remember. So it moves beyond just facts and figures that you might get at some places.
And is there a particular theme that you are most focused on?
So the subject matter that I have the most experience with is looking at the history of slavery in the United States. And so a lot of the themes that I explore in my work have been related to sharing the stories of enslaved people and that journey to freedom, and all of the different ways that it has moved forward and taken steps back, and moved forward and taken steps back in the United States. It's an ongoing process of making sure that the ideals of what the United States was founded upon, those ideals apply to everyone that is here.
That's what's so interesting, I think, about talking to you today, is this idea or this need that we have in the United States, and actually our Russian audience has in Russia, to look at the history, to assess the history, to understand not only the facts, but how those facts are presented and how that is interpreted for us at museums and historical sites. So it's interesting because, as always, history is so relevant even to what we're dealing with today. Anton, I'm going to ask you to please start the slideshow. We have a few slides. because Shawn, what I would like to do is walk through some of your key experiences at historical sites in the United States, mainly Southern plantations, so we can understand what are the issues with interpretation, what do people who visit these sites expect, what are the facts of American history, and who does or does not want us to know a lot of those facts, because obviously there's always controversy around which facts you promote.
Right.
But starting at the beginning, and I know that for you this is the beginning, Jamestown settlement. Can you tell us a bit about Jamestown and your experience there and how that opened up this world of public history to you?
Sure. So Jamestown, just so that everyone is aware, Jamestown is the location where the first permanent English colony in the United States was established, and that was in 1607. And of course, when the English arrived in what is today Virginia, they weren't the only people that were here. There was a number of indigenous or Native Americans who were here, collectively known as the Powhatan Chiefdom. And so when I finished my education, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do with my life. And I saw that there was an opportunity to work at this historic site as a costumed interpreter or tour guide. And so I took that opportunity. And as you can see in this photograph of me, I was assigned to interpret using a costume, interpret the lives and the history of the indigenous people, the Powhatans of Virginia, at the very time that the colonists were arriving in 1607. And that the time period stretched through 1619, which is also the year that the first Africans were forced into Virginia and would later become enslaved.
So tell us about sort of what you experienced there and how this impacted your future path.
Well, I had a passion for history since I was a really young child. I grew up in that area of Virginia, and so I had always been exposed to history and just loved history. So coming to work at a place like this was something that my parents thought was just exactly where I needed to be. And I think what really set me on this career path is I had a person that I worked with who had been doing this his entire career. He had been doing this for 30 years. And he was able to show me that this is actually a field that can be a profession, and it's something that you can do for a living. And that's not something that I had ever thought was possible. And so I've been able to do that. The other thing that came out of this was it was very interesting, and I learned a lot by doing this kind of interpretation called living history interpretation, where you're dressed in a costume. I wasn't portraying any individual or person specifically. I was doing what's referred to as third person. But it became clear to me that maybe what I was doing could be done in better ways when the first Mattaponi, who was one of the Mattaponi persons, started to work at this museum as an interpreter. And I started to think about, well, as a white person who is not Native American, who's not indigenous, is it appropriate for me to be telling these stories in this costume where people might confuse me for something that I'm not? And so eventually I moved away from doing living history, although I think it's a powerful tool. I don't do it myself now, but what it gave me when I was at Jamestown is it gave me a really good, strong foundation in public history and sharing that history with the public.
You know, so considering the world we live in today, is it a problem for you that we have this picture of you, a white guy, portraying this American Indian? I mean, this was a long time ago. So at the time, it wasn't anything. It probably wasn't unusual.
It's still not unusual. It still happens today, and there's a lot of discussions in the field about when it's appropriate to use living history and when it shouldn't be. I mean, living history is a powerful tool because, it was living history that got me really interested in history. As a young child, it really is a great way for children to be introduced to history. And it wasn't until I became an adult that I started to think about some of the ethics behind what I was doing. I'm not at all ashamed of this work that I did. I mean, it's just part of the growing process and the learning process for me. And that's what I look at as far as museums go, is museums really are places for the public to learn, but also for people like myself that work in the field to learn as well. And so I don't think that there's anything wrong with people doing this. It's just not for me. And like I said, it's something that still happens all over. I mean, and it's something that happens all over. It's living history. I think probably has its roots in Europe, and so it's a strong vehicle.
So I know that that was sort of where you kicked off your love of history and your work in that field. Today, you have your own consulting company called Stono Consulting, and we're going to talk about that. But you named it after this river, the Stono River in South Carolina, where there was a slave rebellion. Talk to us about the Stono River, your experience there, what you learned, how it inspired you.
Sure. Well, so I moved to South Carolina after being at Jamestown and eventually took a position at a history center that was on the headwaters of the Stono River. And over the years, I came to learn that I developed a real connection for the Stono River. When I lived in Charleston, I was always living on the Stono River or within just a few hundred meters of the Stono River. I worked on the Stono River. And so as I started to do research at the site where I was working, I started to learn about the history of that site, its association with this river and this riverscape. And then I also started to learn that I have a personal historical connection to the Stono River, and that one of my ancestors who fought in the American Revolution was wounded at a battle very near where this picture was taken. And so I have this personal connection that's there historically, and then this personal connection that I developed and as a professional. And it also was very personal to me because I lived on the Stono River for 20 years. So when I came to making the decision about what to name my company, because it had such a strong influence on my work in so many different ways, it was a pretty easy decision to go with Stono History Consulting as the name. But this is a beautiful river. This is in what's called the low country of South Carolina. It's very flat, and it is the location of many historic plantations all up and down the coast of South Carolina. And these plantations that were here were plantations that during the 17 and 1800s were growing primarily rice and cotton.
And this is also significant because of the rebellion. And this is a piece of history that I know when we, well, I'm a little older, but when we grow up in the United States, we don't learn a lot about how the slaves rebelled and how they revolted and, had the ability to sort of take a stand against their enslavers. Tell us about the rebellion, the significance of the Stono Rebellion, and just how slave rebellions are taught in general.
Sure. So the Stono Slave Rebellion was the largest uprising of enslaved people in British North America. So this is before the American Revolution. This happened in 1739. And the outcome, it was, some people say that it was an unsuccessful rebellion, but that's up to interpretation. All of the sources that describe this rebellion are English. There is one oral history that survives within family members of people that were associated with the rebellion. But they all describe it as having not been successful. But the whole point of this rebellion was for people to be able to seek their freedom in Spanish America and Spanish Florida. At the time in 1739, the Spanish had said that any person that was enslaved in South Carolina or Georgia could get to Florida, they would be free. And so that's what was the motivation for this. And they were on their way. This group of people, numbers vary, could have been anywhere between 70 and 100 people, were making their way to Spanish Florida when they were intercepted by a militia of white colonists and a battle ensued. The descriptions describe people being executed on the spot. They describe people being imprisoned and people being captured. And they kind of gloss over the fact that there was an unknown number of people that got away. And so we never have been able to learn whether or not anyone was ever successful in getting to Spanish Florida. But researchers today are looking at the possibility of that. Instead of looking at it through the archives of the English, they're looking at it through the archives of the Spanish to see if anyone was coming into Spanish forts at that time along the border. The outcome of this rebellion, though, was the creation and enforcement of the 1740 Slave Act. And that is a law that was passed in South Carolina. It was copied in other colonies that really created the institution of American slavery that we know of as today. It created all kinds of conditions under which people were held in bondage. And it also created laws that governed how those people that were enslaving those individuals had to behave and function as well. This law made it so that it was illegal for enslaved people to have access to drums, to firearms of any kind, to gather in groups of more than just a handful without permission. It created all of these different laws that become what is the institution of American slavery, and it's race-based. So this is the outcome of the Stono slave rebellion. And one of the sites that I worked at, was associated with this, and that's where this photograph is at one of those sites, the Elliott and Rose plantations. And at this point, when the rebellion was occurring, at this particular point, there were enslaved people that decided it was in their best interest to defend the people that enslaved them rather than join the rebellion. And one of those individuals, July, who was defending the person that enslaved him, actually ended up killing some of the folks that were involved in the rebellion. He later was given his freedom as a result of this. So this particular site had a kind of a twist on this story. And the question I always ask, because there's not an answer, is what does a successful revolt look like?
Right.
In the United States, a couple generations later, Patrick Henry, who is a famous patriot, he utters the words, he says, "Give me liberty or give me death." And many enslaved people are on record having the same idea. They would rather be dead than be enslaved. And so it's the same idea. So what does success look like?
Right. Success could be just the fact that the rebellion occurred, that people took that step. When you were there at the time, did local South Carolinians know about this history of the rebellion?
Oh, yeah. So, yes, it was something that was that a lot of people in South Carolina in the area knew about. Mm-hmm. However, it was not something that was necessarily being taught in schools when I first arrived in South Carolina. Later, it was added into what was being taught in schools in South Carolina. It was part of the curriculum, but then more recently, it has been removed from the curriculum. So there's this political back and forth about what stories we want to share about our history and what stories we don't want to share.
Why was that removed?
I can only guess at why it was, but a lot of times the curriculum and state school in the school system in the states is very much determined by whichever political party is in power in that state. So it kind of goes back and forth. And unfortunately for students, there's not a lot of consistency sometimes. And so it has an impact on their education. But I would imagine that it was removed for political reasons.
Right. Interesting. Well, it's, history and politics are never far apart. And then this is an image of the memorial sign.
Yeah. So this is a photograph of the unveiling of a historical sign at the site where it was believed that the rebellion started. And this had been made a National Historic Landmark, which is the highest designation in the United States of a historic place. It was made a National Historic Landmark in 1974, but it wasn't until the early 2000s that there was any public acknowledgement of this site being the location, one of the locations of the Stono Slave Rebellion. And so the local community worked to have this sign erected on one of the sites. that was associated with it. And this is the unveiling of that marker. So this is something that the local community was very familiar with, but for a lot of different reasons, we're not initially eager to have this site marked. And that was probably for reasons having to do with safety.
Okay. So this is an image of 12 Oaks Plantation in Georgia, which was the model or the inspiration for Gone with the Wind's plantation house, Tara. I want to turn to your work with Southern plantations, and I wanted to preface that or start the conversation by showing this, beautiful plantation house that is currently still standing in the Atlanta area. It's a hotel for tourists, and there are a lot of weddings and events at this hotel. Another plantation, this one in Louisiana, just burned down last month. This was in the news, and I want to ask you about this because what was interesting about the stories of this event in the news is how there was so much celebration that this plantation house had burned down, because it had been the home of many celebrations and weddings and just wonderful, joyous activities over the years, which left a lot of people wondering, how can you have so much fun at a plantation house where there was so much pain and suffering, or a house that was built by slaves? So the burning of this house opened up that debate. And so I wanted to ask you about that general debate that we're having in the United States about how we should use plantations, how we should preserve them, what we should teach about them, and what we should and should not allow to happen. Can you get married at a plantation? And that brings us to your work with this plantation house in South Carolina near Charleston, the McLeod Plantation. So tell us about this house and about how the United States is preserving plantation history.
Sure. Well, to go back a little bit about the Gone with the Wind movie, that's this famous movie and book, and I think it's important for people to understand that the way that plantation sites have been romanticized. I mean, this is kind of the peak of that romanticizing of plantation sites. But this started even before the American Civil War, where there were novels that were being written that were portraying these plantation sites as romanticized notions, and that continues all the way through. And at historic sites, this is what is the primary way that these places were presented all the way through the 1970s. And it's not until you get to the 1970s that you start to see the beginnings of expanding that story and uncovering a little bit about what was happening. In the 1980s and 1990s, it grows even more. And some of those sites that were doing this were in Charleston, South Carolina. Drayton Hall is one of those places. McLeod, this site here, came open to the public in 2015. And what made this site different from those other sites is that it was the first time that a plantation site, a site of enslavement, was going to focus its interpretation, or the stories that it shared was going to focus on the people that had been enslaved there and their descendants from the 1850s, just before the American Civil War, eventually all the way up till the present. So how are people, descendants of enslaved people, still interacting with this particular site? That's part of the story that is shared at this former plantation site.
So it's more like a museum of slavery or African American descendants at this location than it is a romanticized version of the beautiful antebellum South.
Yeah, I think it's I think it's more fair to say that it is, instead of a museum about slavery, this is a museum about the struggle for freedom.
Okay.
It is because slavery is, these are very complicated and complex places where, yes, there was a lot of pain and trauma that occurred here, but that doesn't mean that the people that were enslaved there weren't able to experience joy and love and those kinds of things. And so like that's something that's unfolding here. And so, I think that part of what the responsibility of a site like this to do is to show all of the people that were there and their full selves as fully developed human beings that experience the whole range of emotions despite the conditions in which they find themselves. And enslaved people were able to resist and able to survive because they were able to find joy and because they were able to have love. And despite the ability of families to be ripped apart, those families still strove to stay in touch with one another. And a lot of times you will see advertisements in the newspapers looking for what were called runaway slaves. And a lot of times those people hadn't run away for freedom. They had gone to someplace else where their family was to be with family. And so like, I think it's really important that we look at these sites as places that are very complex places where there's a lot of depth as opposed to just like this beautiful romanticized notion. Everyone that comes to these places are bringing their own perspective and their own biases to these. And some people are expecting to have that gone with the wind moment. And some people won't step foot on these places because of the way that they've been presented. That goes back to that Nottoway plantation and the people that were celebrating the fire that occurred there. That's understandable because of the way that Nottoway was avoiding its history. And I really don't know a lot about the specifics of this site, but I do understand in general why people would celebrate the burning of this location because of this history of sugarcoating the history that was there. The way that this story has been told in a kind of romantic way, and that's something that a lot of people reject because they know that it's not the full story. It's not true.
So we're talking to you about your career and your profession of helping interpret these stories, working with museums and historic sites to reveal those truths, those complexities. So tell us about how you helped the folks at McLeod put that story together, open up this place, and to train the tour guides to tell that story. What was your role there, and how long did it take, and how successful has it been?
So McLeod Plantation Historic Site is owned by the Charleston County Parks, which is also the site that I learned about the Stono Rebellion at. They're the same owners of both locations. I started working with McLeod Plantation in 2013, and for the first couple of years, we were in the process of developing those stories and those that we were going to share at that site, and making the determination that this was going to be a site where we focused on this journey to freedom. My role there was to coordinate all of the interpretation that happened there, whether it was things that were written on signs or whether it was the guided tours that happened there. And we were able to, after we developed the interpretation, brought what are called interpreters, public historians on board to lead tours and interact with the public. And they had I think it's probably only about 3 months to get themselves ready and prepared to do this work. And it was just a handful of folks. There was a total of 5 of us that were doing this work. That's including me. And we started off and offered training, but it soon became apparent that the training that we used to prepare ourselves for that work wasn't adequate and that more was needed. And so over the course of some time, developed training programs and strategies that have become really the the foundation of my work today that I do with Stono History Consulting. A lot of it came out of what we were doing at McLeod Plantation Historic Site. The experiences that we had there with my colleagues, I don't take credit for that work that was there. That was the work of my colleagues. I was a part of a great team of people who just did outstanding work, and they really set a high bar, and the site became a leader in how to tell the history of plantations and the American South.
So tell me about that training, like specifically, like what is it that the team needs to do to prepare for that? Is it about how they interact with the guests? Is it about learning particular aspects of the history? Like, what did you teach them to do?
So this developed and evolved over time, so that eventually it got to the point where created what I refer to as the principles for ethically interpreting history, for the ethical interpretation of history. And there are two parts. There's principles that describe how people that do this work should interact with the history. So in other words, all of the work that's done at a site like this needs to be grounded in scholarship, and that academic scholarship and primary sources. Secondary sources are important too, but you really need to be able to demonstrate how you know what you know about that site. It's important that these principles, it's important that you understand how people learn, so how people process information. It's important to understand that, like, how many things can people walk away from in any given experience and be able to recall and remember. So if you flood them with a bunch of facts and a bunch of dates, they're not going to be able to remember all of that. So it's really, how do you tell a story is part of what those principles are. And then the second part of the principles are focused on how interpreters, how public historians interact with the public and how they take care of themselves. So it's understanding that these are really places of learning, and that the way that we learn, we process information, and the way that we respond to information that may be new to us or that may contradict what we think we know can range to a variety of different reactions that could be interpreted as negative or hostile or angry. And really, it's not necessarily rejecting that information. It's like, it's just processing it. And so part of that training is to make sure that interpreters understand that process that people are going through, and that they understand that they themselves, as they learn this history, are going to go through that same process themselves. So then it's like, how do you then care for yourself, and how do you take and care for your colleagues so that you are working together and supporting one another in this work? Because one of the things that we're asking people to do at these sites is it would be like walking onto a city street, walking up to a stranger and having a conversation about slavery and racism and discrimination and violence and trauma and all of that with a perfect stranger. And, how are people going to respond to that? So it's like getting people prepared to do that work with people that they don't know and they have no idea how they might respond. And then also recognizing that some people are going to be genuine in their rejection of this, and they will become hostile, and making sure that you understand how to diffuse a situation and how to calm a situation down, making sure that you have safety first, and that you're prepared for those kinds of interactions. And so it's really just getting people so that they're confident in their knowledge, and then confident in their ability to interact with others.
So I can imagine the public comes to this home, this site, and starts hearing these stories that they may not want to hear, makes them feel uncomfortable. They might not believe. What kinds of reactions do you get at this McLeod plantation? What do people question? What do they want to believe, or how open are they to this focus on the journey to freedom for the enslaved people?
Well, it has. I think it has evolved over time. When the site first opened, the public didn't know what to expect. When it became known that that McLeod was sharing this version of the story, this perspective, it began to attract people that wouldn't normally come to plantations. And the reason it's because it was telling a story that they were interested in learning more about. So you went from the beginning where there was a little bit more rejection to today where I think a lot of the people that are going there are expecting this story, and that's what they want to hear. It's at other plantation sites that are incorporating the story of slavery, doing a better job of integrating that history where there's greater resistance, perhaps. And so it's really important that that as people are engaging in this work, that they have that confidence that they need in their knowledge, and that confidence that they need in their ability to talk with others about it. So at McLeod, I think today most people that are going there are not resisting. But when we first opened, I'll never forget one time I was leading a tour out there, and I had a person who, after the tour, came up to me, and she told me, she was a white Southern lady. I could tell she was Southern because of her accent. And she told me that I hated myself because of the stories that I hated myself, that I must hate myself because of the stories that I'm telling, and that I was painting too broad. I was using too broad a brush to paint this picture. She was very opposed to this idea of sharing the lives of enslaved people because she wanted that notion of that romanticized picture of history. I've had.
Well, what did you say to her?
Pardon?
What did you say back to her?
I just said, I'm sorry, man, but I don't think that I do hate myself. And that's basically all that I said. I listened to her. I nodded. I smiled. I just listened to her because a lot of times that's what I've learned is that people, they just want to vent. They're angry. They're upset. They don't like what's being presented. And so if you just listen to them, as soon as I respond and try to defend myself, I then create a situation that can escalate. Mm-hmm. And I'm not perfect with that. I've had times where I have engaged in that and the situation has escalated, and it's not the goal of what a site like this should be. The goal really should be for people to be able to hear different perspectives and have a conversation and dialogue. And some people are going to walk away with a new perspective, and some people will reject it. I've had others that have had. I've had colleagues that have told me other stories about how they've responded to. I've had some colleagues that have had to stop their tours because of responses to how people are responding, because it has escalated to the point where that person has gotten so upset that they've had to stop the tours.
Really? Are there Black tour guides there?
And right now, as far as I know, all of the tour guides at McLeod are African American or Black. Mm-hmm. When we first opened, it was about 50-50. Half the folks were Black, half the folks were white or some other, mixed race. Mm-hmm. So we had a very eclectic group. And that's one of the things that I have found is that the more diversity that you have in your staff, the more people you're able to reach. What I mean by that is that there are some people that will come to a site that will listen to me just because I look like I do. I'm a middle-aged white guy. And for some people that works. There are some people that will come to a site that they really want to hear this story from someone that is an African-American, a young African-American woman, maybe, And so like different people are going to respond in different ways to the messenger. And so also we all bring our life experiences to this work. And so the greater diversity you have in the people sharing this story, the better. And, all of this is our shared history. This is how I see it. It's shared history. It impacts us all. It just impacts us in different ways. And so we have something to contribute in the process of sharing this story that is valuable.
Is there a way to present this history or this interpretation so that it doesn't become an example of a political point of view? Are there specific tactics when you're interpreting history that you make it? Because what you just said, it's a shared history. It's based on facts. But how do you get past the politics? because I can only imagine what half of this country thinks about that interpretation of the history of this plantation. How do you get past that?
I don't know that you get past it. I mean, it's always going to be there. History is political, and it's been politicized. And I don't think I don't know that we can really get past that. I think what's really important, and this is one of the things that I share with young interpreters that are doing this work, is you need to know who you are. You need to know who the other people are that you were going to be interacting with. And awareness of those biases, those political biases, goes a long way. And being open, I've been thinking a lot about this recently about, at historic sites, especially at plantation museums, you can have interpretation that is very romanticized, or you can have history that is very focused on the violence and the trauma. The goal of what these places should be, they should be places for people to learn. They should be places for people to come in and have their minds changed, or have or just like for them to be presented with history and for them to make their own decisions about how they think about it and what they feel about it. And if you're doing the history correctly, and you're sharing these primary sources, and you are sharing multiple perspectives, generally people are going to understand without having to be beat over the head with a particular message. And so I think that really it's being aware of what your own biases are when you come in to tell these stories, and being aware of what other people's biases are, so that you can then use those tools and strategies to navigate through that, and recognizing that it's okay for us to have different viewpoints and different perspectives, and to be open about that.
And one thing that's fascinating about this house is, and I've changed the picture to a view of the original front of the house, I believe.
Yeah.
Tell us about how this house became the typical Southern plantation that it did.
So there were 3 generations of the McLeod family that lived in this house. It was built in 1851. This is the front of the house. There used to be, right where this tree is that is creating the foreground, there was a road right there. That was like the drive that drove past the house, and all of the buildings and everything were behind the house, including the row of houses for enslaved people. All of the barns, everything was behind it. The 3rd generation of McLeods were very interested in promoting that site as a tourist destination. They inherited that from the 2nd generation, the mother of the 2nd generation. And the 2nd generation, I think it was her vision for this site to be a place where people would come to visit. So in the 1920s, as the historic preservation movement in the United States was really gathering steam, that's when places like Colonial Williamsburg were being established. This is a lot of historic preservation begins. In fact, historic preservation begins in Charleston in the United States. And so during the 1920s, the McLeods really wanted to get in on that, because they saw that tourism as a way to make a living. They never did open the site to the public, but what they did is they paid a lot of money to have the back of the house that faced the river turned into the front of the house. So these columns that you see here were added in the 1920s. There was a row of oak trees that were planted in the early 1900s, and it was all a desire to create what people expected a plantation to be, and it became part of annual tour of plantations. And so this becomes the kind of the fake front of the house. And people get really confused, because I always refer to this as the back of the house. And so it's really confusing to people, but it's on purpose, because I want people to understand that this was a creation to kind of this was created to coincide with that preservation movement and the idea of the romantic notion, the romanticization of plantations.
One of the things that I learned when I was talking to you before, as we were getting ready for this, and reading some of your work, in the 1970s, in preparation for the bicentennial, America's 200th birthday, there was a realization that there weren't enough national historical monuments or places devoted to our Black history, or African American history in this country, and so a lot of monuments were sort of established at that time. Has that been your experience, that you've worked at places that were set up in the 70s? Like you mentioned that Stono Rebellion sign was put up in the 70s, but I don't know if it was a part of that. But places that were established in the 1970s to celebrate that part of our shared history. Do you see, was that something that you have been involved in preserving or helping sort of expand?
Yeah, I would say expand. In the 1970s, I was just a little kid. So,
Yeah.
but definitely in the years leading up to 1976 and the bicentennial of the founding of the United States, there was definitely a movement amongst nonprofit organizations, private organizations, to mark and denote places that were important to Black history in the United States. That was definitely something. And there was one group that was doing a lot of this work all over the United States, and they were operating out of Washington, D.C., and they were nominating these different sites, and the federal government was approving these. And so that one site that had the sign, the picture of the sign, it had become a National Historic Landmark in 1974, but the sign letting people know that it was a National Historic Landmark didn't go up until 30 years later. But there was definitely a movement in the United States in the 1970s. So coming out of the 1960s in the United States and out of 1950s and 1960s in academia, you have a group of scholars that are coming out. And by the time you get to the 1970s, their work is being published. And so one of the most important works to come out of this era is a book by Dr. Peter Wood. The title of the book is Black Majority. And it's a book I highly recommend to anyone that wants to know about this period of history and the evolution of slavery in the United States. It was published in 1974. It's just gone through its 50-year anniversary, and that book is still a primary source of information for people interested, students of this history. But that book, along with other scholars that had been in school in the 1960s and early 70s, their work started to get to museums and historic sites and the National Park Service. And then so you start to see the beginnings of Black history, a realistic view of Black history being incorporated at some historic sites. But it's really not until the 2020s that you see most historic museums and sites embracing aspects of their Black history. So it took a very long time, and it took the murder of George Floyd and others to get the museum world to that point where they were largely like, there were lots of people that were doing this already. I don't mean to say that there wasn't, but for it to be something that was a big movement that just about every museum went through started really in the 2020s. So it's relatively recent.
We have a question. So we have a question, and I have a couple loaded questions, and they're all connected. Someone has asked, how do you decide which stories to tell at a historic site? So why don't we start there?
Yeah, one of the things that's really important, I think, is that, and this is something that's relatively recent at historic sites, is that whose ever history is being shared at that site, they need to be engaged in making those decisions about what stories should be shared. So part of it is determining, why is this site important? Why is it worth saving? Why is it worth knowing about? Engaging the people whose history this is a part of, their past, part of their ancestors' past, engaging with them, and then collaboratively making decisions about what are the best stories to share at a site. So that's that to me, and that is part of the principles that I was talking about earlier, is making sure that you're engaging with the community of people whose history is being shared. And so that is the first step, is engaging with those folks and then going from there. The other thing is, and I mentioned this earlier, is the use of themes help us. Determining a theme at a site based on its significance helps us make determinations about what are the best stories to tell. In the field or in the museum world, when you have a sign that's telling a story, you're limited to about 100 words. So it's not like you can tell everything there is to know about something. You have to be very selective. And so engaging with scholars, engaging with members of the community, and then making those determinations together, I think is the best way to make those decisions about, and make sure that those stories are compelling and that they're relevant to your audience, to your visitors.
So for McLeod Plantation, were there descendants of the slaves who had worked on that plantation, or were there local community members? Who were the people who you brought in to make sure that your stories resonated with them or accurately reflected them?
So there was a local historian, oral historian, who was part of the Black community there. This is on a place called James Island. He had been born and raised there. He was the second sheriff's deputy in the county. So he's a police officer. He was the second Black sheriff's deputy in the county. He had been collecting his community stories for years and years. And so we worked with him to learn about those stories. And that was because we were just getting started. Today at this site at McLeod, there's a whole network of people that are local, that are part of how stories are being told at that site. So there's relationships, and those relationships take a long time to build, because at a plantation site that has a history of presenting romanticized notions of history, to build the trust of a community who have been discriminated against to want to collaborate takes time. And you have to be transparent, and trust has to be built. Well, that's something that's happened there. So at McLeod, it started off that way. Those decisions were made from the beginning. And then there was a concerted effort to continue to build and expand those relationships. And I think that at any historic site, that is of primary importance.
Another question: how is your work at Stono History Consulting different from working at a museum? Which is a great question. You could have.
Yeah, it is a great question. And so I still work at museums. I just don't work for a museum. I mean, I do, but I'm not an employee of that museum. So one of the things that I find, and I've been doing this on the side for a long time, but it's just recently that I've decided that I was going to do this, just do this itself. And one of the things is that I have a lot more flexibility in the projects that I work on. I am able to create my own hours, work on projects when I want to work on. So it gives me a lot of freedom and a lot of flexibility. But it also gives me the ability to take those things that I'm most passionate about when it comes to sharing history, and making sure that that's the focus of my work. When you work for a museum, at least in the United States, they are understaffed. So that means that you have to do everything. So in my last role, I was an executive director of a historic site. And, one minute I might be unclogging a toilet. The next minute I might be working with the public on leading a tour. And the next minute I'm working on a budget or working on a collections policy. So all different kinds of things that are all fun and enjoyable, but you're torn in a million different directions. With this, I'm able to stay focused and do the things that I really enjoy doing. And it just brings a great deal of satisfaction, and it keeps me motivated.
Let me ask you this: you've I've looked at your list, your experience list, and you've worked at more historical sites and museums that I even knew existed in the United States. So you have a very broad experience with different institutions. Have there been times when you've been brought into a project, especially now as a consultant, where the museum or the site wants your interpretation, but then starts to get your interpretation and then pushes back because it's going further than they wanted? Do people become uncomfortable with that interpretation?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I've had that happen on more than one occasion, and at sites where I have been an employee of that site and also as a consultant of that site. So, I mentioned, you mentioned earlier that my work is centered on opening new sites and also kind of re-envisioning existing sites. And so some of the re-envisioning that I've done in my career has been like, yeah, we want to do this, but then once you really get into it, there's pushback. Oh, we don't want to go that far. That's not the direction that we want to go. And a lot of it is not because people don't believe in it. It's just fear of the unknown, I think, and it's fear of change and fear of something being different. I don't know that there's anything beyond that that's in that resistance. I had one project that was really interesting that had to do with the Confederate battle flag and how it was going to be presented at a museum. And that was a museum that was owned by the city, by a city government. And they had brought me in to do some consulting about how they should present this in their exhibit. They ended up realizing that the city was not prepared to go the direction that they thought they were ready to go, and they scrapped the entire exhibit. So this was something they had spent quite a bit of money on, and ended up not pursuing because they felt like that they weren't prepared to do that work, which actually is not necessarily a bad thing, because, and I've told other sites this, sometimes what you have up or what you're doing does more damage than having nothing at all. And so it's better to just have nothing than to do what you're doing now. And so to not do something, it may be better, because it's real easy for these projects to go to get off track and to go sideways.
And yeah, I mean, it's hard. It seems like it's hard to go to a historical site now where there's not some reference to slavery or the past, but often it's just in passing. It doesn't go very deep. Is it a requirement now that places acknowledge that past? I'm thinking of Southern historical sites, or actually anywhere in the country where there was slavery. Is there an understanding that it should be mentioned, or are there still places that just completely don't even care about that part of their history?
By and large, I think most sites that are operating as museums and historic sites and not as venues for events, those are two different things. Some sites try to do both, and they don't. The venue and event side of things is almost always going to win out, in my experience. But sites that are purely historic sites or museums, I think that it's not a requirement, but I think that most museums and historic sites are addressing this. And that's what I mean. Like, since 2020, not all historic sites and museums were doing that. At least now, sites and museums are at least acknowledging it. They may not be doing a lot of work in that area, but at least they're acknowledging it. And my experience has been that a lot of them have a desire to do it, but they're unsure of how to go about doing it. And that's what I found when I was at McLeod at this site here. Is we started it, and I remember having one of the first conversations with my team was, no one's ever done this before, so we don't know what to expect. What we didn't know is that there was another plantation site that opened at the same time down in Louisiana, who had the same approach, and that's a place called Whitney Plantation.
Right.
And so Whitney Plantation and McLeod Plantation opened within like 4 months of each other, but we didn't know that the other was doing what we were doing. Since then, the two sites have communicated with one another, but we didn't know that then. And for all we knew, we were the only two sites who said specifically, we're going to focus on the Black experience at these sites.
I was wondering about that, because when you said it was all new, I thought, well, why didn't you talk to the Whitney Plantation? But
McLeod opened in April of 2015, and I think that Whitney opened in October or November of 2014. So there was the holidays in between the two openings.
Fascinating. Well, let's close on hopefully a hopeful note. Thinking about, there was a lot of attention on this after George Floyd in the 2020s, early 20s. Where do you see this going? I know political winds always shift. Do you think that there will be more of an openness in this country to acknowledging that history and focusing on that aspect of the history?
Yeah, I think that generally speaking, there will be an openness. I do have some concerns about the pendulum swinging from one extreme to another extreme. I think I mentioned this earlier. Right now, one of the things that I really am concerned about is making sure that everyone, as many people as possible, feel welcome coming into a space where they don't feel like they're going to be shamed for having been taught something different than what might have been. I mean, I think about people that are my age, who their last experience with history was in high school. And they were taught something in the 1980s that is so far removed from what we know to be the case now. And I'm really concerned about historic sites and museums that are not willing to leave room for those folks to be able to learn, and before they even set foot on the grounds, feeling as if, oh, because I don't think of the way that this particular site or museum is promoting itself, then I'm not welcome there and I'm not going to go there. That to me works completely against what the goals of historic sites and museums are, which is education and learning. So I'm hopeful that we can continue to make historic sites welcoming places. And I'm hopeful that, in the United States right now, there is a real concern for how history is being shared. And I'm hopeful that we can continue to have this dialogue and that we end up headed in the right direction on the side of learning, as opposed to any kind of political rhetoric that might be on the left or the right, but really thinking about how do we learn from the past so that, we can move forward into the future.
Right, exactly. It's our shared experience of the past, and we should share that experience going into the future, learning about it.
Yeah.
Well, Shawn, thank you very much for joining us. This is fascinating. I appreciate
Thank you for having me, Michael. I really appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun.
Great. Thank you.